want to talk about IQ, really, because really that's what I'm talking about, is because the best measure of the intellect aspect isn't a Big Five personality questionnaire. It's actually an IQ test. A lot of people have complained about the idea of intelligence because they don't like the idea. They don't really mind the idea so much that there are smart people. But people really don't like the idea that there are dumb people and understand IQ. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. And the first reason is that IQ is more powerfully predictive of long-term life success than any other phenomena that can be measured among human beings. The statistics that were used to derive IQ tests and then used to predict future performance are exactly the same statistics that every social scientist, particularly psychologists, every social scientist uses to do all of their statistics. So you can't criticize the derivation of IQ tests on statistical grounds without criticizing every single finding in psychology that's ever been made by anyone, ever since we started to use statistics.
Okay, can we take a minute and talk about how a standardized test almost landed me in a special education course when I was in kindergarten because my teachers failed to understand my learning style. So yeah, there's that. So what's up, guys? Today, I kind of want to take a moment and I want to discuss IQ tests. Now, IQ tests are often used to measure one's intellectual ability, and they tend to come with like a lot of weight. Like, people tend to view IQ scores as like, a valid method of, measuring one's intellectual abilities. And when people hear, somebody has an IQ of like, I don't know, like 160, everybody gets impressed, even though nobody really understands what the fuck these scores actually mean. But we're impressed nonetheless. Now, the reason why that we're usually impressed with these scores is because a lot of loud voices like to place a lot of emphasis on IQ testing and standardized testing. And while I'm not here to say that there is absolutely no value in, testing, because yeah, we do need to, especially if you are in education, you have to figure out a means of testing, your students' knowledge. Are they retaining the information that you're trying to convey to them during a given school year, semester, or whatever, what have you, right? So that's not to say that there isn't any value in standardized testing, but putting one's faith in these tests without taking a moment to examine some of the more controversial issues that surround, IQ testing and standardized testing really does us a disservice, right? Because we tend to place a lot of emphasis on one's intellectual abilities as a measurement of one's success in life. And that is not necessarily the case. And in fact, there have been numerous studies that have demonstrated otherwise, where intellectual ability had very little bearing on one's, success in life, because just because you have these intellectual skills does not necessarily mean that you're going to apply yourself, right? I mean, many of us have known somebody who was incredibly smart that just didn't take the time to apply and practice those necessary skills. And, usually it goes, success comes to the person who is, going to take the time to, persevere, or what Tammy Duckworth claims in her academic journal on grit is this attribute that people who tend to be successful have, which is grit. Now, grit is kind of defined as one's ability to persevere and kind of look at goals not in the short term, but rather as a marathon run. So you're not going to get there to the goal, to the finish line, like on the first sprint. People who are gritty, have that grit and the ability to persevere, understand that it's a marathon, that it requires, all these necessary steps to get to what one desires, what one wants, what one's goal is. And so I tend to see these scholars who are placing a lot of emphasis on IQ testing tend to overlook this really important trait. Or they try to chalk it up to something else, or relabel it, but then they don't really explain the definition, which is like really irritating for me, especially as somebody who studies writing and teaches writing and really, just wants the scholar to take a moment and define the terms that they are using so that way the audience understands the parameters of the discussion. Sorry, that's just a pet peeve of mine. But let me get to my point. So, about these issues with these testing, with standardized testing or, using tests to measure knowledge. Let me give you an example. So, when I was in kindergarten, apparently, according to my mom, I had taken a test at the beginning of the school year. And then I had to take another test at the end of the school year, kind of like the test to exit out of kindergarten into a mainstream first grade course. And apparently, these tests reflected that not only was I scoring below my peers, but that it was so low that I should be in a special education course as opposed to a mainstream class. And this really took my mom by surprise. She could not believe that. She could not believe that they were telling her this. And so my teacher and the school apparently really stressed the importance of placing me into this class because the test scores reflected that I needed to be in this class. And so, against their judgment, my mom decided to speak up and kind of vouch for me. And she explained to them, she said, no, I don't agree with those tests. I don't think that those tests are actually, kind of measuring her ability. And I'm sure she didn't say it in those words, but I'm sure that it was probably somewhere along those lines. Maybe a little bit more colorful and a little bit more crunchy because that's just my mom. I'll just call her Edna because that's what I call her when she frustrates me. So Edna, my mom, so Edna decided that no, she didn't agree with what the kindergarten teachers were saying. So instead, she came up with an agreement. She said, look, this is what we'll do. I will work with my daughter during the whole summer, retest her when she comes back for first grade. If she is still scoring way below her peers, go ahead and place her in the recommended class. But if she scores higher, please keep her in a mainstream class with her peers. And so Edna was able to come up with that agreement, and she worked with me nonstop that whole summer. Now, I have really vague memories of this. To me, it wasn't like homework. It was more like my mom would play games. And so she always got me when I was in places where I had to give her my 100% attention, like in the car, if I was in the bathtub or anything like that. She would work with me and she would take me through the alphabet, and then she taught me to sound out phonetically each one of those letters. And then from there, she began teaching me words. And then when I began asking her for things, or if I needed something but couldn't figure out where it was in the house, she would make me read all the labels. She would make me read everything and sound it out. And if I struggled to sound out a word, she would take the time and, the patience to work with me. And so it became a lifelong habit. So once I began to learn to read on my own and to read well, my mom would get me like book sets and then we would read them together at night. And that was like our thing. And so we did that for the entire summer. By the time I got to first grade, I had to retest, to see what first grade class I was actually going to go into. And so apparently I retook the test. Not only did I place into a mainstream first grade class, but my reading actually placed me out of first grade entirely, and I was starting to read at a second grader's level. Throughout grade school, after that, each subsequent class, I was reading out of that level into the next class until I got into sixth grade. By the time I was in sixth grade, I was reading at I believe, junior or senior in high school. By the time I got to junior high and I was in seventh grade, I was reading at a college freshman level. And so my reading comprehension was always insanely high. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is, if Edna had went over there and listened to that standardized test score, who knows what would have happened to my education or the direction and the trajectory, my academic career path would have taken, that I would have kind of fell through the cracks because of a test. And so I once I was old enough to understand what had happened, I kind of look at tests with a little bit of a grain of salt. I don't think that it should be used as a complete baseline because, some people learn differently. Some people, their brains are very different. And the one thing that I really want to emphasize is that, there are some things that these IQ tests can, test for, but they really fall short to quantify what is an accurate measurement for creativity. They have a very difficult task ahead of them. The reason why that it's important to understand the types of questions that are being used for these IQ tests is because we have to ask ourselves, are these questions that were constructed, say, in the 1920s, 1930s, able to accurately measure, the knowledge acquired today? Because what I mean by that is like, in the years that, these in between when these questions were first created to now, there have been a number of different discoveries, different type of, knowledge being created, different types of conversations. We're constantly shifting and changing. And do the tests reflect that? And these are just a couple of questions that I have. I mean, like, there are a whole host of issues that I really just do not have the time to cover in this video, nor kind of get into, because I am so tired right now. It is so late and I'm kind of just want to go to bed, but I really wanted to take a moment and, explain, and hopefully through like my own personal narrative, how these IQ tests can be problematic and should be kind of taken with a grain of salt rather than like a badge of honor, or, that people try to hold up people with like high IQ scores up to. Because just because somebody is going to score extremely high on these IQ tests does not necessarily mean that they're going to be successful throughout their life. And so it kind of goes to this trait that I notice really isn't talked about, but has actually raised a lot of interesting questions when we talk about like, one's success through life, either personal or academic or career or what have you. And what they found was IQ really doesn't have too much of a bearing on one's success in life. A better predictor for success is a trait known as grit. So, Tammy Duckworth wrote this academic article in this journal where she was exploring this trait called grit. And what she found was that people who view goals not as a sprint, but as a marathon, and understand that it's going to require a lot of steps, that it's going to take a while to get to where you want to be, and that there is going to be a lot that an individual might have to overcome to reach this goal. And it's the gritty person, the one that kind of digs their heels in the sand and goes, you know what? This is going to be rough. This is going to suck, but we're going to get through this shit. We're going to make it work, and we're just going to keep plugging along because this is worth it. They found that those people tend to be the more successful ones rather than somebody with just simply a high IQ. And so I think that it would be a very interesting conversation, it would be very interesting to see more conversations shift to these other traits rather than, trying to use a test to, create a standard baseline for a community of people. Because Lord knows, and I hope that story demonstrates that, you shouldn't really judge a book by its test scores. Because if Edna had listened to those test scores, I don't know what would have happened to my academic career. It would definitely have looked very different from during my early years. And so I was just very lucky to have a parent who took the time to really see my strengths and hone in on that and really work to develop them, because I think that not enough emphasis is placed on the development of one's strengths rather than a demonstration across the board through all these testing of one's intellectual skills. So, I don't know. That's it. I'm going to bed. Good night, y'all.